Hello? I got quiet. I can take it. Welcome, everyone, to the first Student Symposium lecture of the 2014-15 year. For those of you who don't know who we are, Student Symposium is an organization here on campus with a mission of elevating intellectual discourse, both in quantity and quality, here on campus. Basically, we like to talk about the issues in an intellectual academic manner, focusing on research-based information. Well, how we do this is we have 5 different lectures throughout the year given by students from Whitworth who are presenting some of their research from their years either here or abroad. And so we invite you to come back. We're going to have another student symposium November 11th. We'll have one in Jan term and then 2 in the spring. For those of you who are here for the intellectual merits of the event, congratulations. Pat yourself on the back. For those of you who are here for a Core 150 credit, please come see me after the question and answer session. I will be up here with a sign-in sheet. Does anyone have any questions about the symposium? Excellent, you're all very well informed. All right.
Next question. When's the next one?
Sorry?
When's the next one?
November 11th.
November 11th.
November 11th. Thank you, Andrew. Speaking of, I have the privilege of announcing our student speaker this evening. Today's presentation on Islamic Just War comes from a student whose research is truly firsthand. Andrew Wheeler spent last spring in the United Arab Emirates studying Islamic jurisprudence with an emphasis on war and conflict in the Middle East and North Africa. In 2013, Andrew represented Whitworth at the National Student Conference on U.S. Affairs in West Point, where he participated in the roundtable discussions called Coming of Age in the Middle East. A triple major in peace studies, international studies, and cross-cultural studies, Andrew has also worked as a fair trade outreach intern at an indigenous museum in San Jose, Costa Rica, as well as an ESL tutor for World Relief right here in Spokane. Finally, Andrew hopes to soon begin a Whitworth fencing club, so look out for announcements on that soon. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Andrew Wheeler.
Is it working? Yeah, it is. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. And I ran through this earlier today and yesterday. And could we turn down the mic a little bit? Maybe? Okay. And it lasted quite a while, so some of it's been cut out, and I expect you guys to notice some spots where things might be missing. So ask questions, write stuff down. If you have anything that you're curious about, just write it down and ask me. If you don't have time afterward, I'll be here so you can ask me about it. But I hope to have time. That said, I'm going to jump right in so that we can get through this on time and so that we can respect your guys' time. So, first we're going to talk about Christian Just War so that we have a base for Islamic Just War. So, Christian Just War was created in the context of St. Augustine of Hippo, who was faced with the dilemma of a newly Christianized Roman Empire. As Christianity maintains a pacifist, personal, turn-the-other-cheek philosophy, and especially the New Testament, what was to do with standing on? St. Augustine determined that a Christian nation was morally obligated to act in the face of grave wrong that could only be stopped by violence. A long-term, positive peace is only attainable through the use of force, but in the short term, pacifism must be employed. Just war doctrine was not fleshed out until 19th centuries after the death of St. Augustine by St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas didn't kill him, but we fleshed it out. The necessary conditions for just war, as delineated in Aquinas' Summa Theologica, are as follows. War is jus ad bellum, or just toward war, when fought either in self-defense and there's a chance of winning, to punish a guilty enemy, or to recover unjustly seized possessions. Providing that all reasonable diplomatic resolutions have been pursued, all just wars must also be fought for a just purpose, not for realist reasons like cupidity, search of power, geopolitics, under a legitimate authority that's in the name of God and a legitimate recognized political authority. And with peace as the end goal, even the battlefield. Wars are used in bello or just in war when fought by proportionate means. The state does not employ excessively violent means, using more violence than necessary in the campaign. The declaration of war is supported by the people. If in the eyes of the people it's not supported, they have duties enjoined upon them to stop the authority from fighting the war. And it's conducted morally, so discriminating between combatants and non-combatants, not destroying infrastructure, things like that. And also diplomatic options have to be exhausted, so war is the last resort. In a comparative paper between Christianity and Islam, we actually, oh, sorry. There we go. In a comparative paper between Christianity and Islam, it's also important to note that the taking of booty and spoils is permissible under Aquinas, as it is under Islamic Just War Theory. Okay, so Islamic vis a bellum. We're just going to create the general structure of Islamic Just War and compare it to Christian. When looking to define it, there's no really widely accepted comprehensive text like the Summa Theologica to turn to, but the constraints of Just War can be defined through critical study of the Hadith, Quran, and historical precedent. And we shouldn't forget that it took the Catholic Church like 1,300 years to come up with a fully fleshed out version of this. It's been about 1,300 years since the Prophet's death. Ayats 39 through 40 of Al-Hajj are in line with Christian impetus for war and help to define Islam, supporting the idea of defensive war. These verses give express permission to attack, subjugate, and it's up there if you want to look at it, and expel peoples to engage in combat for the purpose of regaining their lost possessions and reestablishing their homes and societies, so long as they do so in the name of Allah. This fits with all criteria under the Just War doctrine, assuming the people stand a reasonable chance of winning in the defense of war or in war in general. Christian Just War Theory specifically prohibits fighting when the result can be determined beforehand as not with more bloodshed and ultimate failure. That said, the war described above is defensive, punishes a guilty enemy, avenges wrong, and restores what was unjustly seized. Note that in this passage, there's the inherent principle of limited warfare in Islamic Just War Theory, so it doesn't only serve as an impetus toward war, but also elaborates when and where conflict is to end in the short run. The first three justifications satisfied. It's for Islamic Just War Theory to match that of Aquinas, wars must also be fought for a just purpose, under legitimate authority, with peace as the end goal. Using this selection, one can determine that a just war in Islam must be fought under the name and authority of Allah to protect against those who suppress faith and to create a world in which justice and faith prevail, and Allah prevail. There must also always be an avenue toward peace that remains open throughout combat, for Allah is oft forgiving. Ibn Rushd, who is often referenced by Aquinas as the commentator, is in agreement, but with caveat in his primer that it's not disputed that execution of captives or otherwise after a fight is permitted in cases where the guarantee of safe conduct isn't available after a battle. These executions are for pragmatic purposes, obviously. So Islam has the same general requirements in use ad bellum as Christianity outside of war being waged by an authority for Christianity. The principles regarding Islamic use in bello, or moral conduct in war, come from Abu Bakr, who, there we go, come from Abu Bakr, who delineated 10 rules to righteous combat. Abu Bakr was the first rightly guided caliph in Islam, first caliph after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE. So up there are the 10 rules, and the idea of discriminate warfare is apparent in selection. Children, the elderly, women, and monks. Basically, anyone who isn't required to bear arms for Islam isn't to be engaged in combat by followers of Islam, so non-combatants aren't to be engaged. The ideas of limited war and proportionality are also inherent in Abu Bakr's 10 rules, as the infrastructure of the land and livelihood of the people aren't to be harmed outside of the instances in which doing so is requisite for victory or survival of the troops. Essential to Islamic military jurisprudence and just war theory are the fulfillment of promises as well, forewarning, and the pursuit of peace by diplomacy. A prime example would be the events leading up to the conquest of Makkah. In the years preceding and following the Prophet's flight to Yathrib, which later became Medina, the city of the Prophet, there were negative relations between the followers of the Prophet and the ruling tribe of Makkah, Quraysh. To ensure safe travel to and from Makkah to promote peace throughout the whole of the region, the Prophet drafted a 10-year truce, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Under this treaty, any casus belli between followers or allies of the Prophet and the Quraysh, or allies of the Quraysh, would be condemned and damages paid by the offending side. This is why in 629 CE, when the Quraysh allied clan of Bani Bakr attacked the Prophet allied Bedouin tribe, Muhammad responded by giving the Quraysh 4 months to either pay damages, break off the alliance, or dissolve with Bani Bakr, or dissolve the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. When they elected the latter of the three options, Muhammad led a 10,000-strong attack on Makkah, conquering it and establishing Islamic hegemony throughout the Arabian Peninsula. Before this violent episode took place, many attempts at peaceful resolution were administered. Preceding the violent attack, there was a peace treaty, and then 3 options were offered to fix this. It was only after the peaceful resolution was rejected were not well implemented that the war was waged. Some object to the means by which the Prophet defeated Makkah, deceiving the Quraysh and thinking he had more troops than he did, and silently amassing an army, calling this unjust, unfair warplay. Aquinas addresses arguments like this against ambushes and other seemingly unjust means of war citing Prophet Joshua's ambush on high and Augustine's assertion that provided there will be justice, no concern of justice, whether it be carried on openly or by ambushes. So Islam has the same basic requirements for use and bellow as Christianity. All right. The common postulate regarding Islamic war is that the religion leaves no room for other worldviews, necessitating war against all non-Muslims throughout the world through jihad or struggle. Were this the case, just war with Islam would be sharp contrast with that of Christianity. It would be comparable to with early Christian Rome, which used religion more as an excuse for its expansion policy than anything else. That aside, the idea of an inevitable ongoing physical war between the non-Muslim world and the Muslim world is not an essential doxy in Islam, but it's exacerbated by the idea of the Dar al-Harb and the Dar al-Islam, or the abode of war and the abode of peace, or Islam. Such terms evoke the idea of an irreconcilable dichotomy between the two worlds and have been interpreted as such throughout history. The terms Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam came into prominence after the Prophet's death and are not in the Quran nor the Hadith, so they can't be taken as infallible doxy. They are, however, very useful terms when determining how a Muslim is to act in non-Muslim societies, not unlike the City of God Against the Pagans, written by St. Augustine, where he coined the term City of Man, City of God, which hopefully in 4150 he will cover if you haven't already. There will always be a conflict between the holy world and the pagans, infidel, or heathen world, but that doesn't necessitate violence between the two, though historically is evidence. Strengthening the idea that violence is not inevitable, the Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam are false dichotomy, the Dar al-Hudna, Dar al-Ahad, and Dar al-Aqwa. It is there, sorry. There we go. Which were developed after the Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb, but are not mentioned in the Quran or Hadith either. The first refers to nations with which war has recently ended and are currently protected by truce. The next refers to nations under the influence that contribute to the Dar al-Islam, but don't submit to Allah. And the last is recently conquered lands that have yet to accept Allah by diversity. Categories of people and nations points to an inherent necessity of an Islam that does not regard non-belief as a process spell. These categories act as midway points between the already artificial Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb to create room for peace in what has become an expansionist imperial religion and serves as manners by which one can incline peace back to infidels who are proponents of it. So, in conclusion of all that, the just war doctrine has no fundamental difference without Christianity. The Quran, Hadith, and the rule of rightly guided caliphs set precedent for the essential characteristics. This allows it to, in its own right, condemn wrong while finding roots in secular documents like the UN Charter. The requirements of both use ad bellum and use in bello are met in full under Islamic Just War Theory, with the exception of fighting in the name of Christianity. Not only are there just wars in Islam, but there's also just peace, as exemplified by the establishment of the Treaty of the Daiba by Prophet Muhammad. There's still room, however, for the minutiae of Islamic Just War to differ from that of Christianity as it is generally accepted, steering away from international law under some interpretations. And that's where we get into ISIS. One can look at this construction of just war theory and rightly ask, but if another agent has a different conception of just war using the same sources, how can one combat that claim and criticize their campaign? This theory is deliberately taken from the sources that are listed, and it outlines what's essential to Islamic Just War Theory while including its bounds and elasticity, showing where room for interpretation lies. The argument was made that modern laws can fill the gaps that are left unanswered, but some agents turn to their own fatwas or rulings and opinions to fill these gaps. ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, is one of these agents. To be fair to its contrary interpretation, ISIS's claim to just war will be analyzed by how the organization fills the gaps left unanswered by Islamic Just War Theory, although the basic components outlined in the name. The idea of a Muslim world is not novel history. As with most religions, Islam is a goal of universality, reaching all peoples. Since the fall of the Sacred Man of Europe, the most recent caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, and the partition of the region through the Treaty of Sevres in 1920, in the aftermath of World War I, the Arab-Muslim world has been defined by Western geopolitical borders, not historical lines, in what has become to be known as the Third Crusade Wave, which increased in intensity after the fall of the USSR and the rise of the US to global hegemony. Since the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire, the Arab world has bemoaned the breakup of the culturally and historically tied regions of the Middle East, attempting to eradicate Western imperial, impose nationalism, and erase and redraw the lines created by Western powers a century ago through Nasser's pan-Arabism and today Islamist campaigns. Well, pan-Arabism was based on ethnic-based nationalism. Islamism has a wider scope, including all Muslims, and motivated by the idea of the Ummah, or the brotherhood of Muslims. recent attempt at mending the lacerations in the Middle East between specifically Iraq and the Levant, with a chance of success, was that of Ahmed al-Bakr, president of Iraq, and Hafiz al-Assad, president of Syria in 1978. Saddam Hussein so feared the unification of these states and his imminent fading into irrelevancy that he led a military coup, taking over Iraq to end the annexation in the same year that Khomeini both established and claimed the position of supreme leader in Iran. The subsequent war between these unstable states effectively ended any chance at unification of the regions in the 20th century. This is a quick note of mine. This exposition has been provided to give context for the non-state actor that has effective control and power over the historically acid city of Mosul, Syria, and especially Western Iraq today. It is from the historicity of the unity of the region and the Islamic goal of world prevalence that ISIS, otherwise known by its fully anglicized acronym ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, claims legitimacy. In mid-September this year, 2014, the organization's declared goal expanded from the merging of Iraq and Levant into the creation of a single worldwide caliphate. Since many news outlets have referred to the organization in earnest as IS, or the Islamic State, a truncation of the original acronym but an expansion of the objective. I don't refer to it as such because doing so would be injurious to my Muslim friends, acquaintances, and friendly onlookers. Referring to this militia as the Islamic State passively accepts its claim of authority and obfuscates the goals and scope of, if not the group itself, was funding. It also contributes to a cultural norm of Islamophobia prevalent in the West. As I will argue, ISIS's leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi does not have a legitimate claim to the caliphate and does not represent a just form of Islam or Islamic warfare in even a 7th century context, despite his claims to the contrary. Recognizing this, President Obama refers to it as ISIL, not IS. I say ISIS because I think it sounds cooler. So moving on. ISIS. To start the debate on ISIS' claim to just war, the ideological roots of the Sunni organization must be defined. ISIS heralds Salafism, a puritanical sect of the Hanbali madhab, or school of thought. I'm using madhab a lot, so remember that. The smallest madhab in Sunni jurisprudence. Salafism is split into two main groups, traditional and radical. The former attempts to reconcile puritanical Islam with modernity and Western institutions, whereas the latter, disenchanted with that approach, is looking to remove Western influence and corruption from the Muslim world while establishing Sharia, or the law or the path, in its place. As such, radical Salafism is much more intrusive. ISIS subscribes to radical Salafism, employing Salafi jihad, or Salafi struggle. Those who subscribe to this school of thought are a very small minority, though the appeal of Salafi jihad globally attracts extremist and mujahideen fighters. Mujahideen are the ones who struggle. In a speech on the first day of the holy month of Ramadan, al-Baghdadi enjoined all Muslims to Hajj the new Salafi caliphate and take up arms against secularism, corruption, and innovation. Did not. By the simple act of establishing the caliphate the proper way, al-Baghdadi sees the flocking of Muslims to the new state as a necessary eventuality. The major roadblock on Sharia to the pseudo-caliphate preventing al-Hijra, or the immigration of Muslims universally, being that few agree with his interpretation of Islam and employment of jihad. To discover where points of conflict lie, ISIS' claim to just war and its conception of the new caliphate needs to be critically analyzed. This will be done in the same chronology in which the basic components of Islamic Just War Theory were laid out in the previous section. So, it's called arms. It's used as elements to spell. Interview, there are three causes for just war: self-defense, to punish a guilty enemy, and to recover illegitimately taken possessions. To engage in a war, a state must also stand defensive. Okay, so being fought in self-defense. This is an offensive war, generally speaking. In ISIS is aiming to create a new state or restore the old caliphate by displacing existing institutions. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later on. The justification that this is a defensive war, in the common sense of the phrase, simply doesn't apply as it would in cases of Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood of Hamas, whose charter states that Israel's seizure of Palestinian lands justifies a mass uprising because of the immediate threat that this presents to existence of Palestinians in the region. But this isn't the case for ISIS, even under the rule of President Maliki. The counter-argument is that this is a war in defense of true Islam against Western corruption, or that this is a war combating the sectarian governmental discrimination against Sunni Muslims under President Maliki. The second justification would be that it's to punish a guilty enemy. In a democratic system like Iraq's, social reform should really come from within the community, which I realize can sound ironic coming from an American. But regardless, not from an outside force imposing it. Also, Iraq's opposition of Saddam actually led to a more religious socialist government. He was the head of a Ba'athist regime, and Ba'athism is founded on secular principles. ISIS should have manifested then, not now. I speculate that it's manifested now because of the terrorists doing post-spring Syria and the Shiification of the post-Saddam Iraqi government. Remember that ISIS is a Salafi Sunni group, and Saddam supported the Sunni tribal leaders, most of them, and oppressed the Shia. This incentivizes Sunni dissidents. The establishment of democratic Iraq opened avenues for the government to reflect the faith and values of the Shia majority. Under the Maliki presidency, pro-Kurds and pro-Kurdish Sunnis, and most Sunnis in general, were barred from office despite their qualifications. After the US troop withdrawal in 2012, Maliki even indicted his former vice president on charges of terrorism, which is a crime punishable by death. More sectarian acts followed. The Shiification led to many Sunni tribal leaders and ex-Ba'ath soldiers and supporters allying with contra groups like ISIS, weakening the soft power influence of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and other GCC states, inspiring them to fund efforts to undermine the new government so as to set limits to Iranian Shia influence, while offering home revolutionaries an avenue to utilize their revolutionary tendencies outside of GCC borders. GCC is the Gulf Cooperation Council, except the Arabian Peninsula, mostly. So ISIS also bases some of its aggression on the belief that the Shia are radifa, or deviants, and this is called fear in Islam, which is considered haram or forbidden by most scholars. We're going to talk about that a little more later on as well. ISIS is campaigning not only against the governments of Iraq and Sham, but also, like Al-Qaeda, against a Western conspiracy, defending Islamic interests against what it perceives to be a Western chimera that has a stranglehold over the Muslim world. In a speech on first day of the holding of the Ramadan, al-Baghdadi accused the West of enslaving Muslims and joining upon them the duty to fight Western powers and establish a new caliphate to rescue the enslaved. Al-Baghdadi asserts that Western materialism and secularism are similar to the polytheistic Egyptian empire, whose greatest sorcerers fell in frustration upon seeing the miracles of Allah from Moses. The third justification would be that it avenges wrong and restores what was unjustly seized. This is an easier argument to make. Because ISIS sees Western powers as having usurped the region and placed puppets in the government, it can be seen as noble that they are fighting against said puppets to restore legitimate rule. This would be a better argument in the 30s or 40s, or even before the fall of Saddam, but it's still being made today, especially regarding the Maliki presidency. Until recently, when it deviated from standard US foreign policy, blaming the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for supporting financially and morally and just generally militias like ISIS. So that pulls away from the idea that Maliki is completely American hands. The disassembly of the caliphate is also considered an unforgivable grievance by Allah. He sees a united Muslim world under a just ruler, the caliphate, as quintessential for Muslims to be true followers of Islam. For example, how is one to pay zakat, which is a full tax that goes to the needy, if one can't trust the government to do it, and it's been enjoined on the government to do so? The idea of governmental secularism that could distribute such a tax didn't enter Islamic discourse until the Muslim world came under Western influence, which is seen by many, including ISIS, as a corrupting entity. And under this paradigm, Western systems are incorrigibly malicious, and the only alternatives to this pernicious force would come from the Islamic world, which would include secularism for obvious reasons. He articulates this rather well in the selection that's up there. Yeah. So, continuing on. This is not. There we go. Democracy and polytheism. Radical Salafism also opposes all forms of secularism, but especially democracy, which abolishes the authority of Sharia, or the path of the law, by putting the legislation of man before that of Allah. Abu Musab al-Suri, an Al-Qaeda ideologue connected to the 2004 bombings in Madrid that led to, states it pretty well in the quote that's right up there, saying that those who legislate in front of the sovereignty of God, and whoever obeys him, the legislators, is then considered a worshiper. By calling the followers of non-Sharia laws worshippers of false gods, he's indirectly enjoining Muslims to struggle not only against the gods or the laws and those who make them, but also against the polytheists who follow them. Considering the background of the speaker, one can safely assume that this is the lesser violent jihad and not the greater jihad of art. For the sake of the argument, a conglomerate of A2 and A3 will be accepted as valid in the legitimate casus belli, even though that's... This war is being fought to rectify a certain state system and to restore the wrongly dismantled caliphate. This still leads us to the discussion point, and that's have all reasonable diplomatic resolutions been pursued against war of last resort. This is a hard line to draw on just war theory in general because of the difficulty of determining what lastness is. But if the diplomatic means are leading nowhere and look to lead nowhere in the future and are actively being used as a means of delay so as to continue injurious action, or are being used as a means of preparation so as to be better to fight, just war can be engaged. Assuming a reasonable chance of success is also available. Syed Imam Sharif, author of The Essentials of Making Ready for Jihad, which was used in training camps throughout Afghanistan to train Al-Qaeda militants, takes this one step further, saying that anyone organizing armed resistance should be confident in success. Otherwise, committing fighters and subjecting the general populace to trials of war would be against the Sharia. Under this interpretation, certainly not a reasonable chance of winning was requisite, but an assurance. In his Ramadan speech, al-Baghdadi asserts that any war fought under Allah will have success, though. And we're going to go to ISIS intentions and claims to authority, which is another section of its claim to use that dollar. A just war must be fought for a just purpose, not cupidity, search for power, geopolitics, or revenge. In his Ramadan speech, in this selection that's right there, al-Baghdadi states that the goal of violent jihad is propagating includes unparalleled punishment of perpetrators of wrongdoings. For this to be just, he can't be punishing perpetrators out of personal anger. He can only be doing so for Allah. For the purposes of the discussion, we'll assume that he's fighting for Allah, although this can be interpreted several ways. Some have criticized ISIS also for seizing oil fields and selling crude oil, stating that avarice is among the reasons for the war. While this argument can be made, ISIS needs funds to buy and sell weapons that doesn't just get through booty, and support the organization's infrastructure. Their expansion to areas with natural resources also undermines the power and income of the Iraqi government serving against. And so this is within the confines of Islamic Just War. The seizure of the resources is not a goal in and of itself. As al-Baghdadi criticizes the West for plundering the Muslim world's resources, it would be rather hypocritical for him to do otherwise. It also has to be declared under legitimate authority, in the name of God, by political authority recognized by the Ummah, or religious scholars. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi al-Husseini al-Qurayshi is not ISIS's leader's original name. I'm not going to go into his full name because it would take like 10 minutes. He chose this new name to appeal to ISIS' goal of restoring Islam to its roots. Abu Bakr, his new name, was the name of the first caliph, and Baghdad was the capital of the caliphate for upwards of 7 centuries under the Abbasid dynasty. His current title is Caliph Ibrahim, but it seems wrong to note these parallels. The Al-Qurayshi chunk of his name lends to the claim of legitimacy to the caliphate under Salafi jurisprudence. He purports himself to be Qurayshi, the tribe of the Prophet, which realistically isn't verifiable. Even Saddam claimed this. Also, consultation and the approval of Muslim scholars, mujtahid, is necessary for caliphate. ISIS is al-Baghdadi and Al-Qaeda is al-Zawahiri, the two leaders of those groups right now, don't have this, openly rejecting the advice of recognized ulama. As a result, ISIS is referred to as a modern Kharijite or stepping out movement that's decidedly contrary to Islam in common Muslim discourse. What al-Baghdadi does have is a significant number of armed forces through Iraq and the vote of ISIS mujahideen, or fighters, strugglers, which is the constituency he cares most about, though he would obviously welcome the mandate of the entire Muslim world. So peace also has to be the end goal, even in battle. Al-Baghdadi asserts that the goal of ISIS is peace, and this is a just war ordained by God. Through the destruction of Muslim holy sites, graves, homes, and mosques, the extermination campaigns, crucifixions, torture, beheadings, and live burials, and the execution, expulsion, humiliation, displacement, subjugation, and rape of Yazidis, Shia, Kurds, Turkmen, Shabaks, Alawites, anti-ISIS Sunni, rival anti-Assad rebels, Christians, the elderly, women, and children throughout the country would indicate that chaos, not peace, is the goal of the organization, despite its claims to the contrary. It must also be noted that al-Baghdadi promotes terrorism as ISIS's main tool for restoring the caliphate, enjoining Muslims to engage in terrorism, and there's a selection there that's rather lengthy, but I felt like including it all because I wanted you to have some context, and also a list. He promotes terrorism as the main tool, enjoining Muslims to engage in it, as he sees it as the only means of freeing the Muslim world from evil. Terrorism, under its common use definition, is necessarily discriminately indiscriminate. It hits civilians. However, in the first paragraph of the selection of his Ramadan speech, al-Baghdadi redefines terrorism to mean a rebellion against Western institutions and imperialism. It's possible that he's using the word terrorism because it's a label that's been thrust war against terrorism, which translates under al-Baghdadi's interpretation as a war against those with the proper conception of Islam. Thus, true Muslims are faced with a tautology that it's necessary to be a terrorist, to be a Muslim, because it's necessary, because to be a Muslim means it's necessary to be a terrorist, at least under Western paradigms. In the second paragraph of this selection, al-Baghdadi condemns the acts that ISIS has been committing throughout Iraq and Syria to especially other Muslims. In doing so, his claim to Isabel holds under the assumption that he believes the soldiers are well trained enough not to carry out senseless acts. Regardless of this belief, the reality of the situation points to the contrary, and unleashing untrained, bloodthirsty soldiers who are unwilling or unable to follow commands and enjoin proper conduct in war upon a population is wholly immoral. Once again, for the sake of the argument, we'll assume he believes the soldiers to be capable, moral, rational, and well-trained actors, though implicit with this assumption comes with the belief that al-Baghdadi is either incompetent, ignorant, or some combination of the two. Okay, so now we're going to go into Use and Bella. That's another quick list, so that's in your brains. For war to be just in its conduct, it needs to be proportioned, supported by the people, and conducted morally, so discrimination and things like that between combatants and non-combatants. So the first one is proportionality. Al-Ghazali asserts that in the instance that a ruler is unjust, people are not to Muslim if the alternative is chaos. The benefits of waging a war or conducting military action must outweigh the costs. If re-establishing the caliphate means killing hundreds upon thousands of civilians and many Muslim mujahideen are to die in the venture, is it just to fight the war or commit military action in civilian zones where discrimination isn't guaranteed? Most people during al-Ghazali's era, which was during the caliphate, would agree with his interpretation. A similar principle can be applied to post-caliphate, democratic, unjust reality. Iraq is in chaos. The death toll has exceeded 150,000 and 11 million citizens have been displaced. As this is a subjective determination, ISIS can claim that its war at least fits this criterion. Another aspect of proportionality is that the least violent path to victory during a war must be employed. This means that regardless of effectiveness and speed, extreme violence and acts of injustice aren't excusable. A state can't, for example, nuke a belligerent city and still hold the moral high ground, as this entails the deaths of innocent combatants. It also unnecessarily destroys the infrastructure and environment of the region, removing prospect of normal human activity in the affected area for years. While a nuke may be an extreme example, one can scale this down to the bombing of public facilities like mosques and voting booths. It also has to be supported by the people. Here too I defer to ISIS. Its constituency and the voices that matter to it are in support of the war, although the overwhelming majority of the locals being oppressed by the group aren't. When Osama bin Laden, the founder and leader of Al-Qaeda from 88 to 2011, was confronted with the critique that he was ignoring the rulings of the ulama, the scholars most qualified to interpret the Quran, he stated, well, we got bad ulama and we have good ones. I listen to the good ones and disregard the bad, which really just proves his critics right. He assumes that his interpretation is correct and ignores the experts in the Quran. As ISIS's splinter group that was expelled from Al-Qaeda for the bad face it was giving the organization, it lumps Al-Qaeda in with the bad ulama. So its constituency is thus rather small. And morally conduct. So this one's a little bit longer than the other ones. The justification behind moral restrictions in war is that doing so mitigates these atrocities. Non-combatants are not to be targeted, as delineated by Abu Bakr, nor is this destruction or looting to occur. However, ISIS targets women, children, religious minorities, buildings, homes, and farms, and more, violating every rule set by Abu Bakr, from whom al-Baghdadi takes his name. Further, ISIS is recruiting and training children as young as 10, which are specifically excluded from those who are to fight the violent lesser jihad. In standard Islamic Just War Theory, and even al-Baghdadi's speech, the point of war is to strike at an enemy's military capacity, crippling its source of hard power so it can't subjugate the Muslim community. When confronted with the issue of a lack of discrimination in Al-Qaeda terrorist tactics, Osama bin Laden, in a truly Aristotelian way, replied that to be a citizen of a state means engaging in the political process. And in a democracy, everyone is supposed to engage in the political process. So therefore, everyone is responsible for the country's actions, the state's actions and policies. What he doesn't grasp is that in America, there are a lot of apathetic, inactive people, and also there were some people against the wars. It's one thing to punish negligence. It's another to punish someone who's doing what he could. Beyond this, he also doesn't distinguish between direct targeted violence and the indirect collateral damage that comes with war. The U.S. might be striking high-value targets, its HTVs, and hitting civilians while doing so, but it's not aiming to hit those civilians. However, you got to be careful when using an argument like this. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the Jordanian jihadist responsible for the rise of ISIS, gained infamy for his suicide bombing campaigns in Iraq, which inspired Osama bin Laden to invite his group to join Al-Qaeda in the first place, becoming Al-Qaeda of Iraq, AQI. When confronted with the accusation of targeting civilians by bombing voting stations and other public areas, he replied that it was not his intention to kill innocents, and subsequently the civilian deaths were collateral damage resulting from strikes against specific targets. You can see where Osama bin Laden draws his rhetoric. The point remains that justice becomes unjust when civilians are labeled as direct targets. And both ISIS and Al-Qaeda do that. Many of the 5,500 killed and 12,000 injured between the months of January and June 2014 were non-combatants. Al-Zarqawi's teaching, upon seeing the conduct of AQI in 2004, warned that the honored status of Mujahideen is endangered by the indiscriminate attacks of violence, which is certainly true. The current leader of Al-Qaeda, while advocating a broadened scope of violence, encourages ISIS to engage in struggle against the Jordanian government as well, but to lessen its scope a little bit and not target non-combatants for similar reasons. But ISIS also kills other Muslims. While sympathizers can make the argument that those who do not follow the Salafi school of thought or the broader Sunni madhab are apostates, and when it's to kill apostates in the Sharia, determining what constitutes a Muslim and where the line lies between apostasy and Islam is a matter that has been debated for millennia. The general consensus is that there's room for interpretation in Islam, which is what led to the different madhahib, or schools of thought, and that if a man utters the shahada, there is no doubt that Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, in sincerity, and does not renounce it, he's a Muslim. And to kill that man is the greatest crime that you can do, unless he's committed a crime that's worthy of death. So, regardless of this, if a man's found to be an apostate, and under most madhahib, he is to be given 3 days to recant. Beyond this, if a man's conviction is in doubt, if he utters it, his proclamation of faith is to be respected. Although that is murder of Shia and Sunni imams and the massacres throughout Iraq and Syria of other Muslims are ardently contrary to the idea of moral conduct in war under Islamic jurisprudence. The apostasy clause also doesn't speak to the murder and rape of Muslim children throughout Iraq and Syria. Come on, here we go. An additional requirement in Islamic Just War, especially jus in bello or jus post bello, is the jizya. The jizya is a protection tax available to Ahl al-Kitab, or people of the book. That's Christians, Sabians, Jews, and sometimes Zoroastrians. Its main purpose during the reign of Radhika caliphs was to ensure that non-Muslims in recently conquered lands showed recognition and subservience to the new Muslim authority. This idea came from the same speech of Muhammad that introduced discrimination into combat, which I actually didn't cite because it's further down a little bit. Non-Muslims in newly conquered lands were given 4 options. They could convert, pay the protection tax, leave, or forfeit their lives. Several media sources have indicated that jizya is being offered to Christians and Yazidis, which is a splinter group of Zoroastrianism, primarily in northern Iraq, by ISIS. One media source has a number attached about 500 USD. To put that in perspective, with the Gini Disparity Index added and the CIA World Factbook's GDP per capita, that's about 10% of minorities' income being demanded on demand, which is thoroughly unreasonable. Compared to homes and zakat, it's so much more than what would be required of a Muslim for just a token of subservience. The reports of Yazidis fleeing ISIS-controlled territory in droves lends credence to the large and unattainable cost of the jizya. They can't pay, and ISIS has proven it is willing to literally crucify its enemies. Asking for such an impossibly expensive token of subservience is unjust. They should either be allowed to leave, electing the third option, or be allowed to live, since they're not being allowed the third option. In response to ISIS's treatment, there we go, of refugees, trapping 40,000 on Mount Sinjar and blocking humanitarian aid in an attempt to starve them out, and the imminent threat to Americans in Erbil, President Obama announced targeted airstrikes and aid to the siege. Following this, a graphic video recording of James Foley was released by ISIS and widely distributed online. The footage, released on August 19, 2014, so not too long ago, begins with the message, Bismillah, I can't speak Arabic, I'm sorry. In the name of God, the most gracious and most merciful. Followed by a news of Obama's aid and airstrike announcement and a message to America read by James Foley himself. He was shortly beheaded. He was beheaded shortly afterward. The message read, I call on my friends to rise up against my real killers, the U.S. government. Think about who made the decision to bomb Iraq. Who did they really kill? When you probably dropped that bomb, they signed my death certificate. After the beheading, the executioner showed another captive journalist, Stephen Salthoff, essentially saying that his fate was in Obama's hands. He too was beheaded in our video released on September 2nd this year. So ISIS's strategy, strategies, that's not good grammar. ISIS's military plan is twofold. Combat Western powers so as to decrease their ability to control the Muslim world while attracting mujahideen, and to carve out a sphere of religious and political influence by undermining world government's ability to rule through brutal guerrilla tactics. If the execution of James Foley is a method of deterrence, it won't work. Acts like this will only foment anger and ultimately reintroduce U.S. presence into the region. Assuming that this is their role, the video begins making a lot more sense. By killing an innocent American, ISIS is drawing U.S. funds, well, eyes even, forces and equipment into the region. Because America is war-weary, it's unlikely to actually have boots on the ground, which means that most aid will manifest as air support and munitions and money toward rebel groups, or they would have preferred the Maliki army, the Iraqi army, that's to say, because it's proven itself to be incompetent, and funds that go into that group just end up in ISIS's hands. The military aid to the region doesn't only give them more access to weapons and booty, but it also follows the more general Al-Qaeda strategy of committing acts that will draw a U.S. response akin to that of 9/11, crippling the American economy. In 2002, in his essay, Al-Islam War, Osama bin Laden's strategic aide, Ubal al-Qurayshi, states that aborting the American economy isn't an unattainable dream. This is a firmly ingrained idea in Al-Qaeda rhetoric. Even President Bush laid credence to the claim in a post-9/11 commencement address at the U.S. Military Academy West Point, stating that a few $100,000 in the hands of 2 dozen evil men caused all of this, and the dangers haven't passed. Al-Qaeda, and now possibly ISIS, has been able to instigate expensive, extended military campaigns from inexpensive acts of war. Further, it's hard to hit HVTs, highway targets like bin Laden or al-Baghdadi, while it's comparatively easy to kill indiscriminately, which further incites the perceived need for intervention and investment on the part of the U.S. This is a real threat, and consecutive blows to the American economy through expensive military expenditures can, in the words of ISIL jihadist Saif al-Adl, tear it apart. Not only does this cripple the U.S. economy, but it also exposes weakness in the hegemony, rallying further involvement in the campaign against the nation throughout the Islamic world, while buttressing the idea that the U.S. is playing a heavy hand in Middle Eastern affairs, bringing back memories of colonial mastery and European occupation following World War I. For ISIS, this is a win-win. If the campaign is successful, the U.S. will come to an end. If it's not, it'll serve to reinforce ISIS' claims about the West. And if the West doesn't react, it's passively accepting ISIS' claims to authority. Earlier, ISIS's intention to create more chaos, not peace, was alluded to. Following in the footsteps of the Muslim Brotherhood, Che Guevara, and Al-Qaeda, ISIS is employing Foucault's tactics. The basic step in a Foucault's uprising are to cause chaos through violent guerrilla warfare, direct this popular violence at the government, and calm the violence by offering food, money, security, a new institution to rule the nation. The fulcrum of this theory is that the success of a revolution itself is not contingent upon public support at the outset, but that by undermining and exposing the government's weaknesses, revolutionaries will act as vanguards of the revolution, and in doing so, create the public support necessary for a successful war. This theory is inherently flawed in that it has no demonstrated predictive capacity. Che's Foucaultism failed in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and failed in Bolivia. It can be determined from history that for a people's revolution to be successful, the support of the large majority of the population already hostile to the government is necessary. This is the case in the successful